In this lesson, what I want to do is take an introduction to Parliament. We're going to be examining the structure and the role of the legislative branch of the British government. We're going to be talking about the effect of Parliament in terms of its ability to scrutinise and hold to account the executive. We'll talk about the interrelationship between Parliament and the judiciary, and we'll talk about the structure, the methods, the roles, and the powers that Parliament has over the next few lessons. But first, we're going to take an introduction to Parliament, what Parliament is, how it works, how it is formed, how it is structured, the difference between, for example, the House of Commons and the House of Lords, the role of the Speaker, etc., etc., etc. So this is going to represent an examination of some of the most basic principles of our parliamentary system. And I guess the first question you might want to ask is, what is Parliament? What actually is Parliament? What does it represent? What are the component constituent parts of Parliament? Well, Parliament, as we know from the previous lessons, specifically looking at the Constitution and some of the basic principles of the Constitution, Parliament is the supreme legislative body of the United Kingdom. So it alone possesses what we describe as parliamentary sovereignty or legislative supremacy. They are synonymous with each other. And the result of which is that they have the ultimate power over all other political bodies that in the United Kingdom and overseas territories in relation to the creation of legislation, the creation of law, statute law specifically. That is what Parliament essentially represents. And when we look at any kind of governmental structure, when we look at any kind of constitutional structure within states, we tend to delineate powers between the parliamentary, within the legislative branch of that government, which is the branch of government which is responsible for the creation of law, the executive branch of that government, which is responsible for the creation of policy and the execution of that law, and then the judicial branch of that government, which is obviously responsible for the interpretation and the application of that law. So that is essentially what Parliament represents. It is the supreme legislative branch of the UK government. Parliament is also what we describe as bicameral. Now, bicameralism is this idea of Parliament being split into two different chambers, bi meaning two, cameral referring to the chambers or the houses of a particular parliamentary system. So you can have unicameral systems within the world. You can have tricameral systems where it's three different chambers. I believe Spain is a tricameral system, for example. And it means that the UK being bicameral is split into two houses. We have on the one hand the House of Commons, and then on the other hand we have the House of Lords. All of this should be relatively simple to understand and relatively menial in terms of your studies already. You should know all this pretty much already. So I'm just going through it in a very basic way. Now, the main functions of Parliament, are as follows. There are multiple different functions that Parliament has, and there are a few main ones, So the first of the main functions of Parliament relates to the institution of Parliament being the supreme legislative authority within the United Kingdom. And that means that the first main function of Parliament is to enact legislation, such that, and to such an extent, that no other body of law or institution can enact legislation without the consent of Parliament. So we could talk about, for example, the Scottish Parliament or the Welsh Assembly or the Northern Ireland Assembly, or local council creating policies and all this kind of thing. All of those are answerable to Parliament. The Scottish Parliament only can enact legislation because of the legislation that was passed by Parliament that allows the Scottish Parliament to do so. The next major function is the sustaining of government by choosing it, removing it, and providing it with the money by voting for taxation. So one of the interesting and unique features of the United Kingdom's constitutional system is the fact that the Parliament, i.e. the legislative branch, and the government, the executive branch, are fused. We have a fusion of powers between those two branches of government. And that means that the government is derived out of and derived from the pools of the parliamentary system, from Parliament. So the government is formed out of members of Parliament. The Prime Minister is also a member of Parliament. So too are the front bench of the Cabinet. The shadow Cabinet, of course, not being part of the executive, is a member of Parliament. Or all of the backbenchers that form the leading party, the majority within the House of Commons, they are all members of Parliament. And so as a result of this, the pool from which ministers are chosen by the Prime Minister, in the sense of someone doing a cabinet reshuffle, for example, and therefore the pool from which the government is created, is chosen from, is Parliament, the members of Parliament, the MPs in the House of Commons. And Parliament also has the power to remove those individuals by way of votes of no confidence and a couple of other things as well. And they also provide it with money for the voting by voting for taxation policies. Parliament also has the function of holding the government to account by scrutinising government decisions. We will get to the methods by which this takes place in the future, but it does so through a number of different methods, one of which being the committee system that exists to scrutinise not only legislation, but also to scrutinise government policy and government policy decisions, okay? Another way in which this is done is through parliamentary question time. This is for the Prime Minister. This is on Wednesdays at noon. But this also goes on for other ministers as well. Every other minister is also subjected to parliamentary question time, where they are questioned most often by other backbench MPs, as well as questioned by the shadow minister on the opposite side in the opposition. So, for example, there will be, if there is, for example, questions that are put to the Minister, the Secretary of State for Education, they will often be questioned by the shadow Secretary of State for Education across the bench, across the aisle, in the shadow government, in the shadow front bench. And then they are also questioned by backbench MPs as well. This is to scrutinise their decisions. This is to criticise their decisions and to hold their decisions to account, have a certain amount of accountability. They also debate in public matters of public concern as a focus for the nation. Okay, so they will debate on issues relating to anything from foreign policy to education policy to issues relating to Brexit, for example. And these are sometimes ad hoc debates that are just sort of that come as the result of and in response to major events that takes place. So, for example, one of the most famous debates that takes place within Parliament was the decision to initiate armed forces actions against Syria. And there are a lot of speeches and debates that went on all the way into the night when this was actually something that was taking place. And that is important. It is important for every single political opinion to have their voices heard on a particular matter that isn't necessarily the passing of legislation per se, but is specifically in relation to the voting on decisions. And then just how, in the similar way that the parliamentary system chooses the government, okay, and can remove the government, they are, like I've mentioned already, a recruiting ground for ministers, okay? Ministers come from backbench MPs, okay, and then they are recruited and picked by often the Prime Minister in a government reshuffle system, and they will therefore come from the parliamentary benches, from the government benches specifically. So, as mentioned earlier on, we have two houses within the parliamentary system. We have the House of Commons and, of course, we have the House of Lords. The House of Commons is the elected branch of the parliamentary legislature. It is made up of currently 650 members of Parliament, MPs, and they are the elected representatives of the people in their constituency. When you vote in a general election, most of you will not be of age to vote in a general election yet if you're studying A-level politics. At least in your first year, maybe some of you might in your second year. But when you are of age to vote in a general election, you will be electing your member of Parliament. You'll go to the voting booth and you'll get a little card or a little piece of paper, and it will give you a list of names, but the names will be represented by a party. So you don't vote, for example, for the Conservatives. You vote for your member of Parliament, for your specific individual who is a Conservative MP or a Labour MP or a Liberal Democrat MP. And so it will have the name and it will have the party that they are representing next to it. Okay. Now, most people colloquially these days will just vote for not necessarily their MP. They don't necessarily care who their MP is. They will vote for the party. So they will vote for a Conservative MP regardless who it is, or a Labour MP regardless of who it is. But in reality, when they put that vote in, when they put a little cross in that box, and then they put it and they fold it up and they put it in the little box and then walk away, they have voted for a specific individual, not necessarily a party. The House of Commons itself is split into two. We have on the left is where the government sits, and on the right we have the opposition. Simple as that. Very simple. And it is the role of the opposition to scrutinise the decisions of the government. Okay, so it is the role of the opposition to criticise in as many ways as humanly possible and to really hold to account the government decisions that they make. Because the point of the opposition is that they want to be in government. And so they want to scrutinise every decision that the government makes, and the result of that is to show that, well, actually, we are going to be better when we get into government, or if we get into government is more likely the correct interpretation. There are examples where the opposition will vote with the government, specifically on hugely bipartisan matters that are very, very commonly understood to be the role, or maybe they will vote with the government after the government allows for a number of concessions. So maybe there is legislation that is being passed and the government decides to allow for a certain amount of concessions that are required by the opposition, and then therefore they are able to get the votes to allow for that piece of legislation to pass. But it is often the case that that doesn't happen, and the main reason for that is because the government controls a majority in the House of Commons, and so there's not necessarily even the need to bring across opposition leaders or opposition votes to get a piece of legislation passed. So it's a little bit of a back and forth in terms of being able to whip the conservative, or in this case the conservative backbenchers, to be able to vote with the government. So the scrutinisation is done through a number of different methods. We will get to those methods as we move on and go into more detail in future lessons. Remember, this is just an introduction to Parliament. We'll get into it in more detail in future. Now, the final thing I want to mention real briefly is the Speaker of the House of Commons. Now, the Speaker of the House of Commons is the presiding officer of the House of Commons. And the Speaker will preside over the House's debates, and they will also determine which members may speak, when they are able to speak, when they should stop speaking. It is the rule that if the Speaker is stood up, you are sat down and you do not speak, and they get often very, very angsty and very unhappy if that does not happen. The Speaker is also responsible for maintaining order during the debate, and they may punish members who break the rules of the House. And again, just like with members of the government, ministers of state, the Speaker is elected from the pool of MPs. So if the Speaker is an MP but does not get a say in voting on legislation, then there is the question that has to be asked about the representation that the people of that constituency may actually have. The current Speaker or the previous Speaker, had, or any of the previous speakers, did not have the ability or a say in the voting of legislation, and they were supposed to be non-biased, and for the most part speakers are very non-biased. So that raises a question: if they are non-biased and they do not get to vote in legislation, but they are members of Parliament, and so therefore they are elected by constituents, those constituents don't have a voice, therefore, in the passing of legislation. This is a question that is often raised in relation to the role of the Speaker and the pool from which the Speaker is elected from. And it's often a debate that is had about the democratic representation that those individuals in those constituencies may have.